I think it's been well documented that I'm a fan of Ari Aster, who came into the fold pretty well into the whole elevated horror ordeal, and made a name for himself not by changing the game or inventing a completely new language, but by delivering such solid entries in the genre, with such clear visual command, pretty much back to back, that they've maintained their hooks in pop culture. Establishing himself with both features as a horror director, it's easy to look past his roots in provocative dark comedy, employing the same juxtaposition of bright Saturday morning cartoon imagery with brutal, often sexually disturbing phenomena you'd find in a Todd Solondz film. Most notable of this batch of shorts is his 30-minute AFI thesis, The Strange Thing About the Johnsons, which went viral and cemented his provocateurism years before he got caught up with A24. This sensibility would evidently lend itself incredibly well to the horror framework Hereditary and Midsommar operate in, but I think both movies are funnier than people give them credit for. They both have moments of pretty standard comedic relief, but I think the actual horror bits rely on a matter-of-factness that people aren't used to, which I think is the secret sauce that made his films take off as much as they did. It's a twofold tool that makes funny things scary and vice versa, and even though so many scares were notoriously met with laughter in Midsommar and especially Hereditary, I think it was more indicative of a unique discomfort than anything else. Needless to say, I was pretty excited when like 4 years ago Aster announced that his next film would be a nightmare comedy. I couldn't wait to see what a bigger and bolder extrapolation of these shorts, even a direct adaptation of one of them, would look like. And it brings me so much pain to report that Beau is Afraid did not quite scratch the itch for me. Not only is it partly a direct adaptation of his short film Beau, but it seems to pull heavily from a lot of his other shorts too. From the drastic efforts of an overattached mother to keep her son psychosomatically under her wing like we get in Munchausen, to the class discrepancies of threatening bodies outside a giant upscale house like in Basically, or general homeless anxieties in C'est La Vie. I should mention that, of these films, I much prefer Munchausen, which operates like a silent film, and carries itself with transitions that are at once fluid and compelling, and also so fluid it borders on parody, to the likes of Basically and C'est La Vie, which both use a language of fourth wall breaks walking us through the characters' lives to explicitly blow through a whole Rolodex of topics Aster's been sitting on, under a thin veil of fiction. Beau is Afraid, which operates like a clip show of all these films and themes, has more in common with what Basically and C'est La Vie both describe as a series of clinical tableaux than with the tight narrative work of his previous features, essentially breaking down into 4 short films that serve as stops on the titular Beau's odyssey to get to his mother's house. In fact, its previous title, Disappointment Boulevard, I think more accurately connotes the sense of museum tour through a collection of oddities and anxieties that the movie actually is. And as such, there's inevitably a lot of good bits sprinkled throughout. What if swallowing pills without water killed you? What if leaving your apartment open, even for a second, allowed the whole neighborhood to ravage the place? What if your mom is literally watching you have sex? What if your therapist not only broke confidentiality, but was in fact a spy enlisted by the very people you complain about? They range in scale, but these moments playing out as they do serve the same purpose as Rachel Brosnahan taking us on a house tour or Bradley Fisher walking us through the entitlements of LA pedestrians. In those films, I found that even when the characters open up from the satire and reveal their anxieties, the material is all handled so explicitly that they don't really transcend into anything more than the sum of their parts. And I think with Beau is Afraid, even though these moments are dramatized and not as verbally explicit, they're still so rhetorically pointed that they have the same effect. I think it makes sense then that the strongest part of the movie is what I would call the first of these 4 episodes, as I think it's the tightest narratively. This is the part of the movie that's directly adapted from the short film Beau, presenting a dystopian cityscape that's dense with anxieties and maintains an active sense of danger throughout, even in Beau's apartment, which is supposed to be a safe haven. All these small anxieties serve the series of clinical tableau function of the act, while also serving as a series of setups and payoffs that build to something greater than themselves. Because if there's one thing Aster's especially good at, it's setting up these devilishly cruel Rube Goldberg-esque situations to put his agencyless characters through hell. In his previous movies, this happens slowly across the span of the whole thing, and in this one, it concludes the first act and ushers us into the rest of the film, opening the next act with Beau having been rescued by a nice suburban couple. And while I commend the idea of releasing the stranglehold for a bit, and giving us a false sense of safety before opening Pandora's box back up, I can't help but feel like after this moment, the movie only continues to loosen its grip. Maybe it's because each subsequent act plays a similar card of false safety, and even from the start we know that there's no real safety to be had in this world, and that the rug's gonna get pulled out from under us eventually. There's no attempt at hiding it, and the film plays into that knowledge with a winking irony. That's part of its whole mission of externalizing anxiety, getting us antsy and even impatient for when things are gonna go wrong again. I would say then that the problem is the lack of agency here, but again, Astor's no stranger to that lack of agency, and if anything, playing into his character's passivity in the past has been a strength of his. In Hereditary, he outlines a sort of manifesto regarding his narrative approach, in which he posits that a world where everyone is predeterminately doomed to their fate and can only futilely try to break out of it before succumbing is more tragic than one where people are faced with the consequences of their own decisions, which is then exactly what we see play out in the movie. He continues this practice by telegraphing the whole story of Midsommar through a mural at the start of that movie, and here having Beau watch the rest of his journey play out by fast-forwarding a security camera live feed. What I think this passivity really is one prong in Astor's umbrella interest in artifice, which I'm decidedly a big fan of. Hereditary is full of miniature models of the characters and frames the house itself as a miniature set, as the characters of the story are models being manipulated by Payman, and the story, in a grander sense as a piece of fiction, is a series of models being manipulated by Astor himself. And he's leaned into the artifice in new and exciting ways, that passivity being one of them, but also by embracing a digital, uncanny look full of unabashed CGI. Almost like if Robert Zemeckis realized how horrific his own creations were and doubled down on that. In fact, twice now, Astor's cast child actors who were popularly believed until proven real to have computer-generated faces. That's probably why Scorsese's taken such an interest in the guy. But this fascination with uncanny artifice has been a divisive quality of Astor's work. It's why people felt such discomfort from the scares of his first two movies. It's why his naysayers complain about a detachment from his game piece, cardboard characters, and it's part of the reason I love his approach so much. It's also the glue that puts him in conversation with his contemporaries like Nathan Fielder, who just did a show futilely trying to artificially construct his entire life, or Charlie Kaufman, whose movies have slowly grown more and more mechanical, arguably peaking with a movie where a man futilely tries to artificially construct an entire city and the lives of everyone in it, which was a clear influence here. The apparent lack of rules or limitations to Payman's power in Hereditary reflects the infinite realm of power a director has over the elements of their film, which is the scariest notion of them all. Ironically, illustrating this limitless power in that movie was itself a much more focused effort of Astor's than we get here. So I think the problem with Beau is Afraid isn't the artifice, or the passivity, or the inevitabilities in the story, but rather that in the past he was using the dolls to create compelling fictions that along the way highlighted the nature of the dolls themselves, whereas this time around, he's so overwhelmed by the dollhouse that all he really manages to do is show us the dolls for what they are. To make a probably lame comparison, think about Andy in Toy Story, creating narratives with the toys, and Sid, whose nightmarish toy abominations speak for themselves. Rather than lure us in with narrative bait and surprise us with fucked up toys along the way, Beau is Afraid seems to explicitly announce, here's an unfiltered collection of fucked up thoughts from the twisted mind of Ari Aster. Which on paper sounds like an exciting shift from conventional storytelling, but it amounts to so much buildup that these thoughts are inevitably not as fucked up as they promise. Maybe it's because I'm desensitized to Aster's tendencies and at a certain point the bubble has to burst, but I think it has more to do with the emphasis he gives these things. It almost feels like leaving space after a joke for audience laughter in a sitcom, or even worse, and this is easily the meanest thing I'll say about the movie, like...
You know what? I'm about to say it. Say it. I don't care that you broke your elbow.
Provocation only really works when you don't announce beforehand, hey, I'm about to provoke you. There's a difference between being matter-of-fact and being in your face, and I think one moment that exemplifies this movie's tendency toward the latter is near the very end where Beau's trapped in an attic and encounters his father, who is in fact a giant penis monster. Which reminded me of the various moments in Hereditary that obscure the demons just on the brink of underexposure, lingering long enough for the audience's eyes to adjust and wander and eventually notice these things. When Beau enters the attic, that first shot of the penis monster starts to do this, but then we cut to a reaction shot of Beau and then back to the monster, immediately lit up and unmistakable. Maybe it's just a horror versus comedy thing, but the movie seems confident enough in the mere conceit of a penis monster to then do anything interesting with it, which I think is true of many of the ideas vomited on screen here. I think this also highlights how Hereditary, for its passive characters and ball-in-motion third act, is still able to force some active viewing from the audience, scanning the screen and finding these essential elements ourselves. It even weaponizes that passivity by getting us to plead with the unstoppable force of the narrative to change its course. By becoming more active and bombastic with the camera here, Beau ironically makes its own experience a more passive one. And though the unstoppable force is still chugging along, this one beats us into submission early on and gives us little reason to try and challenge it. Maybe it's also because the movie doesn't really provide a counter-argument to what it's saying about the characters' relationships. For all the artifice in Hereditary and Midsommar, there's still a grounded sense of humanity with relatable human nuances. There's an attempt at critiquing Beau as a passive, spineless coward who genuinely doesn't appreciate his mom as much as he should, but all these issues he has are so clearly demonstrated to be consequences of her emotional abuse in raising him, there's no real debate to be had. There's some abstracted sympathy for her motivation here. The idea of Beau adopting his father's behavior is actively avoided by the cover story she gives him, a sort of false heredity, and we're perhaps to understand that this shelter is because his dad was, you know, a massive dick. But Patti LuPone gets her own Toni Collette I am your mother speech in this movie, and this time it's 100% unbridled guilt tripping, with no ambiguity or potential justification. Part of this issue has to do with the movie's complete detachment from reality, whereas the other movies had some grounding in which these nuances felt natural to come by. This movie is cerebral to the point where distinguishing between what's real or diegetic and what's not is just completely misunderstanding the language. But even though it's all specifically externalizing Beau's psyche, you never really get the sense that he might have played a role in his own victim complex, that he actually is anything but a victim. It's almost like the narrator is so unreliable that in a roundabout way, you believe everything he says. The final scene of this movie is a cerebral court battle ripped straight out of Albert Brooks's Defending Your Life, which I only bring up because I know Brooks is on record a big influence on Astor. But Beau's court scene operates on an entirely opposite logic. Every instance shown of Beau's cowardice, we can clearly see, as Beau does, that the truth is being distorted by Richard Kind as the prosecutor. Defending Your Life confronts actual moments of cowardice and feels confessional and sincere, whereas there's not an inkling of suspicion that Beau's own cowardice was the problem in any of these situations, but rather these manifestations of his guilt, which is to say that his mom is unquestionably the problem at every juncture. If we're maybe supposed to believe that Kind's absurd accusations are actually the reality, and we're only seeing Beau's deeply deluded perspective of the events, then the language of anxiety completely contradicts itself. And if they are in fact absurd accusations, which, you know, obviously I read them to be, then that makes the movie a compelling visualization of what living with anxiety and guilt is like, but I don't know. Forgive me if I think we're a little past that. That's what's so frustrating here. The movie goes to such great lengths over the course of its 3 hours to constantly pull the rug out from under us and provide images and set pieces we've never seen before, and it's all in service of the same thematic idea we start the movie out with, never once changing or fleshing it out more. There are interesting reveals that keep us roped in, but all they do is hammer away the same rote point. The security camera reveal. Mom is always watching. The reveal that Beau's mom is still alive. Guilt carries on even after death, and you can never be certain you're not being a disappointment. Mom is always watching. The reveal that Beau's therapist is reporting back to his mom. Guilt about complaining about guilt. Mom is always watching. The play in the forest where Beau sees a life where he has a family. What could have been if Mom weren't always watching. The whole attic situation, a manifestation of the guilt Beau feels in actively challenging his mother, instilling his passivity. Mom is always watching, and you will let Mom always watch. The army vet with PTSD who shot himself 40 times in the chest is still alive and still chasing Beau. No matter how much you try to subdue your trauma, it follows you for life. Mom is always watching. Turning Parker Posey to stone after finally having sex and seeing his mom witness it. Again, Mom is always watching, and by having sex and being an independent man, you're disappointing her. It's just rinse and repeat. Different angles of the same thing. Maybe the bluntness and repetition is the point, and maybe it's on me for not being able to see it, but I'm really struggling to understand what grander statement this roteness is making. And the best aspects of all these moments are their narrative ingenuity, but because the movie places itself so beyond the realm of narrative in the first place, it's kaput. So it doesn't work on a thematic level, and it doesn't work on an experiential level, because it's all provocation without edge. Astor has repeatedly delivered gut-wrenching image after gut-wrenching image, but by the time this movie gets to its final smashed skull, the defense attorney landing on a pile of rocks, we've gotten so much of it that none of it really punctures anymore. Regarding the movie's other influences, I've mentioned Synecdoche, New York, but there should be a case study for how much more that movie manages to be about while still doing the whole robotic, cerebral, world on fire thing. Not to mention how much more it folds in on itself and properly becomes a snake eating its own tail. I also think Kaufman slowly submitting himself more and more to the artifice helped it service his work more than Astor, who in this drastic leap seems to have become consumed by it. Southland Tales is maybe not a direct influence, but certainly a movie that comes to mind. A maximalist provocateur comedy that's gained a reputation as the Richard Kelly career killer that people seem to think and almost hope that Beau is Afraid will be for Astor. But not only did Kelly go on to make a movie with twice the budget after Southland Tales, hardly making that alone a career killer, but also Southland Tales this is not. Adam Naiman, in his review of Beau is Afraid, writes in comparison to The Master that in that movie, the protagonist's psychic damage is a conduit to sophisticated ideas about American history, culture, and society, whereas with Beau, its virtuosity is in service of something distinctly single-minded. And I think that also applies to the successful Provocation of Southland Tales as opposed to here. All of the outrageous imagery and situations don't just speak for themselves, but draw currents to provocative socio-political ideas. Because Beau is so abstracted, there's no opportunity to realize down the line that, for instance, its sitcom-esque neo-Marxism bits were subversively ahead of their time. I guess if this movie were ahead of its time, I, by definition, wouldn't realize that now. And I hope I am wrong, but for the time being, frankly, the movies this felt most similar to watching are Under the Silver Lake, Blonde, and Babylon. Blonde in its visually ambitious emptiness, and Babylon in its feeling of both unsuccessful pastiche of its influences and employment of the given filmmaker's signature tricks in a less effective manner than his previous movies. But mostly Under the Silver Lake, which operates in a similar mode of maximalist hijinks that pause every now and then to try and fill in the gaps with overt pathos regarding a relationship the main character had in the past. I think the relationship in Beau is Afraid is more organically incorporated, but I think Under the Silver Lake as a whole manages to cover more ground. I mean, after all, the relationship in Beau is really just a bait and switch to go back to the maternal guilt. It's entirely mechanical. The worst part about this is that in no way am I against A24 or Ari Aster making this movie, and in no way am I suggesting that studios should practice more control over the creative aspects of their movies. I know that's been a whole discourse thing surrounding this movie. I think some pushback is always a little healthy for a movie, but in general, this kind of creative freedom is exciting to give an artist, especially one who's been as exciting a voice as Aster's been. I'm actually really upset I didn't like this movie, specifically because of how it seeks to confront narrative conventions. But I don't know, the other movies demonstrate that sometimes simplicity just works. Granted, this is the time in his career he should be trying different stuff and thinking outside the box. I just don't think this movie even is all that radical or alienating or inaccessible, and its thematic conception is cripplingly inside the box. And that all of this is packaged and signed off with a final shot of a disappointed audience leaving an auditorium, the movie almost preemptively and insecurely declares that it's trolling the audience. But if that's so textually what you're trying to achieve, then you're ironically not trolling the audience at all. Maybe that's the big prank. I know this has been a pretty brutal review of a movie from someone I genuinely really respect and admire as an artist. Part of me thinks it's a good thing that seemingly such small changes to his framework caused the whole thing to crumble. Because again, under its shaky structural integrity, there are, again, a lot of great ideas here. But unfortunately, rather than a spectacle of disaster, the net result is a whole lot of stimulus that amounts to not much of anything. I promise, this is a movie I want to like. I hope in the future I come around on it, but I had to speak my truth. I also watched this in IMAX at the Lincoln Square AMC, and this movie was not shot for IMAX. It was my first time watching something on that screen, which I'm pretty sure is the largest IMAX screen in the country, or at least was until it was recently usurped. And it's also the first time I've ever felt like a screen was actually too big for what I was watching. And that's not even a diss toward the movie, that's a matter of how it was conceived of and shot. But I do wonder if seeing it on a smaller screen and taking in the compositions more holistically would help me enjoy the movie more. Not that most of my hangups here really have anything to do with composition. I think in that department Aster and Pogorzelski did as good a job as ever, but maybe it would help everything congeal. I don't know. In any case, if you're looking for a review where I'm not a complete cynic, you can check out my last video, which was on a movie I actually really enjoyed, believe it or not. Or you can check out my various social media profiles, where I usually talk about movies without the pressure of what's hip and relevant right now. Or you can check out my Patreon, where I do monthly recaps of all the movies I watched in a given month. The choice is yours. Until next time, this has been Beau is Afraid. Thank you for watching and goodbye.